welcome. Welcome. We've just started recording. Welcome to the third session. Hello. In today's future series. We're really looking forward to this conversation. We've already been talking about what to expect afterwards on how we can restore Scotland's natural capital. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Richard to introduce himself and start the conversation. How the session's going to work is Richard's going to share some slides, do some talking, and then we're going to move into a small group discussion where we can talk about what's emerged through the initial slides.
Yes, well, gosh, thank you so much for having me. I'd like to thank Tabitha for having me, but also Net Zero Scotland. It's such a pleasure to be here. So, as you might expect, I'm passionate about Scotland and about Scotland's wild landscape. For those of you who are at COP26, physically, this wild landscape, which you can see on the first picture, is only about an hour and a half from where you're located. So Glasgow is one of the gateways to the Highlands, really, and it's a dramatic place where the mountains erupt from the sea. So the marine life is very diverse. We have a rich diversity of fish and whales, and the land itself is extremely important and wild and rugged. It's an untamed place. It's a special place. It has been altered, and I'll say a bit more about that as we go through the slides. So one of the surprising things really about the UK is how little forest there is here. And really, it's one of the least forested countries in all of Europe, possible exception being Iceland for obvious reasons. They have glaciers and volcanoes and a different climate, really. But it's been altered, all through the millennia since the last ice age, really, and significantly through the Roman period. It's in effect been the breadbasket of a lot of Europe during various empires. So it has fundamentally changed. In particular, we're interested in the boreal forest because I'm speaking more about the Highlands today. And the boreal forest is actually circumpolar. So it starts off on the Aleutian Islands and goes across Alaska, Canada, northern parts of the upper Midwest and the east coast of the US, through Scotland. Of course, Scotland was once connected physically to the east coast of North America, separated by plate tectonics, continues across Scandinavia and other parts of Northern Europe and Russia, all the way around again. So it really is a massive landscape, which itself is bigger than many continents. And the species that would have been across this whole landscape would have mainly wrapped around the world. I'll say a little bit about that in a moment, but importantly, here in Scotland, we had what was known as the Caledonian Forest, which covered much of the Highlands. The Caledonian Forest was a unique ecosystem where Scots pine was the dominant tree species. Scots pine do wrap all the way around the world, so you have them in Canada and Russia, but they're typically not the dominant species as they are here. So they're really adapted to this landscape. The UK became isolated from Europe following the Ice Age. We had been connected to mainland Europe during the Ice Age. And as the ice sheets retreated, the trees colonized as the ice moved north, and animal life and humans moved up as well. A big difference with other parts of Scotland is that they're mainly deciduous. So you will have a mixture of different forest types, but the Caledonian forest was the largest contiguous forest with much of the surrounding areas also forested. So this map shows you to the right the current extent of the Caledonian forest in the black dots. So you'll see there's very few places where there's any substantial areas that are remaining. The striped areas to the left represent the full extent of the forest historically, and then within the map on the right, that's an area that is planned for major reforestation. So it is a fundamentally altered landscape. It is so different than what it would have been like. At one time, Scotland would have really looked like Canada. In fact, many people who migrated to North America, who were Scottish, settled in Canada and the northern parts of the US, and people from Scandinavia as well, because it represented really the sort of climate that they were used to and the sort of topography that they were used to. So there are old growth remnants of Caledonian forest that still exists, they're essentially scattered in locations where they are inaccessible to farming. So they're either on rocky outcrops, for example, or islands typically. There are a few other areas which are on mainland, but they tend to be in remote parts of the highlands where there would not be farms in the vicinity, if you see what I mean. So these are our last remaining old growth forests. And our inspiration at Highland Carbon is really to complement these and expand them. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that as we go through the slides. So at one point, the whole of Britain was covered in rich flora and fauna. I know we're talking about trees today, but it's the whole understory, the shrubs, the plants on the floor of the forest, the lichen, the mushrooms, the insects, small mammals, amphibians, birds, large mammals, everything in between. It was a rich, dynamic ecosystem like you would see in a national park in Canada, for example. And before the Romans, we had brown bears in Scotland, which surprises a lot of people, and wolves. So the brown bear that was in Scotland was the Eurasian brown bear. So that is the cousin of the grizzly bear. It's the symbol of Russia. You might recognize it from that. So they, in effect, wrap around the globe, as I was saying earlier. The lynx, which was here, was likewise the Eurasian lynx. So it was the cousin of the Canada lynx in North America. And likewise, we have the Eurasian beaver. And wolves were eradicated some centuries ago, so they've been here longer than some of the other species. The exciting thing is that in recent years, we have had reintroductions of the Eurasian beaver. So this has been into Scotland and into England, and they are actually spreading and doing very well here and doing a great deal of good for the landscape. Likewise, boar has been reintroduced. These are both species which really are engineers of the landscape and help to return it back to what it would have been at one point. So what happened to the Caledonian forest? It's been almost completely lost. And really it's the story of centuries, but it's been removed in major moments during those periods. So it's everything from building construction. If you go into even a large church or a large historic building in the UK, they can have several hundred trees used in their construction. And you can imagine entire towns that were built through the Middle Ages up to present and still used for construction. Everything from ship construction, where I sit now, the roof in my house is made of old ship beams, so that from the Middle Ages. And that really drove the British Empire for much of its early days. One of the most significant things really has been conversion to grazing. So that's for sheep grazing and shooting estates for deer. And that has been really raised to an artificial level. And this was amplified during the period of the clearances. So we had our own sort of version of indigenous people oppression in the 1800s here in the UK, where Scottish people were cleared off the land, off the highlands and the islands, and in many places replaced with sheep. And that had a big effect on the landscape. What a lot of people don't quite realize is the early days of the Industrial Revolution was fired by timber. It wasn't until much later that coal became the dominant fuel source, so that would have had an enormous impact, of course. And then everything from trench building during World War I, we had Canadian lumberjacks based in Scotland who were milling the timber that was used in trench building. And that happened again in World War II. So really, there's just been major pressure by humankind on the landscape. When we look at Scottish mountains and Scottish vistas, they really seem wild. They're certainly rugged, but they are fundamentally altered. And the grazing pressure is so enormous that seedlings will not have a chance to take root. So you'll see within this picture a quintessentially Scottish view of a number of glens where there's very few trees that can be seen. There's a huge amount of grazing pressure here. In this case, it's a more remote area, so it's mainly due to deer. So if you would imagine somewhere like Yellowstone or Calgary, perhaps in Canada, where you have predators in the landscape, deer continue moving. They never loiter in one place. So the sort of damage that they have in the landscape is in a sort of a mosaic. Whereas here, without that predator pressure, the deer loiter for long times. And if they're in an area where seedlings are starting to take place, they will obliterate them. And they won't just obliterate the trees, they'll obliterate almost all of the plant life. So one of the difficulties that we have now is that the grandmother trees, like the one that's pictured in the small picture in the upper left, those that are still producing seed, and there's very few that are, those seeds are now becoming sterile. So the trees are getting too old to produce seedlings. So there's a lot of intervention that's taking place in the forestry arena in order to source seeds at scale and to propagate them. And that's an important part of the narrative of what's happening here in Scotland. So this picture now gives you an idea of the impact that grazing can have. This is a deer fence along an enclosure. Now, I understand that in this particular location, there was no tree planting that took place. So it was just keeping the deer out, allowed the seeds that were already within the soil to take hold and to grow because they weren't being removed. This is something, it's a tactic that we also have to use when we're planting forests to make sure that they can take hold. So one of our raison d'etres, if you like, at Highland Carbon is to plant forests at scale. I was inspired when setting up Highland Carbon by international NGOs and their big thinking about doing projects at scale. And I noticed that in the UK, quite a lot of the carbon initiatives in the woodland arena were really smaller scale woods planted on arable land and scattered all over the landscape. And my inspiration really was to endeavor to create large contiguous areas of woodland, which would return the landscape to what it would have been in the time before the landscape was so altered by mankind. And we do this in various ways, including joining up existing old growth woodlands and expanding them. And we work very carefully to select where the projects take place. So this includes reviewing the rare species that are on site, but also looking at where the sites of special scientific interests are located, special protection areas, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and other designations. But we do these plantings whilst building vast fences around them. The fences are between 2 and 3 meters high, and that is essential to keep the deer out during the time that the trees need to grow. So they grow to an age of about 25 years or 35 years, depending on the type of tree. After that, the fences are removed. The deer and other wildlife can then move freely through the landscape and benefit from mixed grazing, shelter belts, and a diverse plant life within the enclosures. So our inspiration really is to return Scotland to look more like this. This is a picture in Scotland, but you can imagine this might be somewhere in northern Minnesota or Ontario. It's what most of Scotland would have looked like, a diverse natural planting scene with wild rivers meandering through it. So really our big vision is to restore areas to their former splendor and to take Scotland back to what it would have been in key locations, whilst benefiting the rare species in those areas. And the way that we undertake the planting is with diverse planting schemes. So this isn't a monoculture plantation like you see over much of Scotland. There will be mixed coniferous plantings, mixed native deciduous areas, and they sort of feather together. So it's not one block and then another block. It's to replicate the way the trees would naturally propagate through the land. And so whilst people travel through Scotland, you probably see a lot of forests. Most of those are monoculture. So there's very few places like this, and that's why they're really so important. The other area that's of great interest in the UK is peatland. And we have, it's around 20% of the world's peatland in Scotland, and 80% of that is degraded. The areas that are pristine are very important because they have an amazing diversity of plant life. There are dozens of species of plants that live within the peat bog. Their biomass builds up the peat over time. It's dominated by sphagnum, but there's also a lot of really interesting carnivorous plants like pitcher plants and honeydew that you see in this picture. There's a rich diversity of bird life that benefits from peatland, whether year-round or whilst migrating through. We have curlew and northern diver here, and you'll also have small mammals. We do have otters, for example, and foxes on some of the sites that we have restored. The important thing with peatland when it's healthy is that it is a carbon sink, and it's even more efficient than woodland at trapping carbon within its biomass. It traps around 400 to 500 tons of carbon per hectare over the life of a project. And we've got a huge opportunity in Scotland because most of the peatland looks like this. So this is a hag and gully that you see here, where the site has been drained for generations, probably for grazing and perhaps for shooting. The interesting thing is that as these sites become rehydrated, of course, they cease to emit carbon, which is an important consideration. Peatland is itself a major source of CO2 emission. It's in effect like a giant compost site, which is breaking down continually and emitting CO2. As the site becomes rehydrated, it becomes a carbon sink, as I was saying, but also it becomes beneficial for estates which had been shooting or grazing. And the reason is because these sites are so degraded that they're no longer healthy for grouse. Grouse chicks can fall into the gullies and not be able to clamber out. And there's very little diversity of plant life. So it's not very good browse for small birds like grouse, and it's poor browse also for mammals. These sites, when they're restored, do not have a fence around them, so deer and other large mammals can move through them. Within certain limits, they're even allowed to be grazed, and in fact, that can be beneficial to have some grazing, which causes some disturbance on site, and that helps increase the diversity of plant life on those sites. So I've got a few examples of some of the projects that we've done and are in the process of doing. This first one, we sell small batches in relation to this project in Wester Ross, and this is one of the biggest peatland projects which has been undertaken to date. This is an interesting example because the water source which comes off the site, which I'll highlight with my cursor, there's a burn that flows through here. It feeds directly into the drinking source for the local community. It then feeds into a river and a loch to the south, and another burn and a loch to the north. So this is a good example of how undertaking projects on land have a significant impact upon water quality, because the peatland itself is essentially like a giant filter. It's filtering out all of the detritus and all of the sediment that's in the water into the biomass, and clean water is coming out of the bottom into trout rivers and salmon rivers. In terms of woodland projects, one of our exciting projects we have coming up, it's going to be ready for sale next year, is at Loch Ness. And this is particularly exciting because there's a number of projects along the shore of Loch Ness which are rewilding. There's some on the north shore and some on the south shore. And so this is becoming a large area where habitat is being restored. The estate where we are working will likely be doing future projects. We're already talking to them about doing some peatland projects on their estate as well. And they're surrounded by 3 large estates and, in effect, continuous wilderness. So by restoring these areas, we're really having an amazing impact on an important part of the puzzle. We also have a project at Blackford. And this project, we were talking about the clearances earlier and Indigenous people. There's an interesting narrative here insofar as there's a Roman fort adjacent to the project. So the Romans did get quite far up into Scotland. They didn't manage to stay there, as we know, for very long. So this is interesting in the context of all the discussions that are happening around Indigenous people at COP26. This site is to the east of the Trossachs National Park, and so it serves as a conservation buffer to that park. There's all sorts of rare wildlife in the landscape, including red squirrels, pine martens, eagles, and others. Tay Forest project, this is to the east of Loch Rannoch. It's not far from Blair Atoll, to give you an idea of where it is. There's a lot of forest already in the location, so we are expanding existing established forests with old trees, with mature trees. An exciting thing about this project is that the Eurasian beaver is known to be in the area. So it's got an interesting link to a recent reintroduction, which is very nice. You'll notice, just to highlight here, there's nearly 500,000 trees in this one project. So that gives you an idea of the scale. And we are in conversations with estates presently where projects will comprise millions of trees. So the scale of the projects that are happening in the UK by Highland Carbon and by others is increasing over time. There are certain challenges in the supply chain for that as it relates to deer fencing and seedlings, but the supply chain is adapting to it. So it is an exciting time. Another thing that's really brilliant about projects like ours is the community economic impact that happens. So the Highlands and Islands, for example, are some of the remotest places in the UK. And it can be very challenging for people who live there to achieve sustainable income through the whole of the year. They often have seasonal income to do with work that they do on the land. There are the sorts of communities where there might not be a local shop, for example. They may have to commute more than an hour to local amenities or to schools. So by bringing revenue into a project in locations that are remote like this, there can be millions of pounds going into the supply chain. And that goes across all sorts of things, from those who install the fencing to sourcing the raw materials, such as stone that's used for the dams on the peatland sites. It's for the laborers who work in planting the forests, ecologists, all sorts of scientists are involved with these projects, and tree nurseries. But also downstream, you have a big impact as it relates to ecotourism. So the tourism sector in Scotland is one of its biggest sectors. It's up there with whiskey, really. And fisheries are the three biggest. So by improving these wild landscapes, we help to attract people to these communities over time. And it is known, there's been all sorts of studies on the reintroduction of, for example, white-tailed eagles to the Western Isles and the impact that that had on the landscape. So rewilding overall can have a dramatic impact on ecotourism. We are just one part of that, really. So that's benefiting everything from B&Bs, hotels, caterers, and those involved with travel. So really our vision is to help to restore nature, to support economic community development, and to help to renew the human spirit. And we believe that because the work that we're doing, the sort of renewal that's happening in nature is something that renews the human spirit, whether it be those who visit the sites and see them firsthand, or those who learn about the work that we're doing and develop hope from what we're doing. And importantly, we are achieving sustainable development goals that cascade down from the United Nations to the UK and to Scotland. And we have a high alignment, according to our independent audit, with climate action, life below water, life on land, and partnerships for the goal. And then we also take a lot of the SDGs, all of them to a degree, whether it's medium alignment or low alignment. So that is it from me. And now we can just really open up the conversation.
Thank you very much, Richard. Jimmy had posted a question in the chat box when you were speaking there, and it said you mentioned units for sales investment. What is the minimum cost investment? So I think you're referring to a slide there, Jimmy. If you want to unmute yourself, you can maybe expand a little bit.
I don't want to expand, I'm already big enough. No. When you're going through there, you were mentioning units for sale. Could you explain that clearly? Because I was wondering, were you selling off packets that people could invest in? That wasn't 100% clear.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that, Jimmy. So the quantities can be as low as dozens of units. That's something that we bring to this because it's quite typical that the larger businesses larger brokers who are in this space will only sell tens of thousands of units, and we will sell small batches. And our price point is somewhere between 11 and 25 pounds, and it depends on whether it is a coniferous forest project all the way up to peatland projects and high biodiversity initiatives. The prices are more typically to the lower end of that range, and the average is probably around 15 pounds. I did want to acknowledge that we have Andre Purple on the meeting here, and he's with Balloon One. And Balloon One are one of our corporate partners, so I wanted to thank Andre and everybody at Balloon One.
I'm just curious to see what you're up to, so I thought I'd join this call, Richard.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess we count as a small sort of a batch. I think we projected our emissions for the next 10 years, and it's come out to about 2,000 tons. So that's the kind of quantity that we were looking at as a business.
Yeah, so it's wonderful to have businesses of all sizes involved. And what's great about the way that we partner with companies like Balloon One is we can do batches over multiple years. So if a company says that they want to achieve net zero by a particular date, we look at our projects in terms of the vintages that are available. We match them up to those milestones as best we can based on the availability.
So could you clarify then, if I invested £1,000, what would my feedback be?
So the purpose of offsetting in the UK is not for investment, it's for retiring units. So the way that the market is set up really is that companies who want to offset their own impacts can do so, or organizations. There's all sorts of public sector organizations and charities who also offset. There's local councils who offset, for example. So in purchasing the units, they are becoming the end user of those units. So those units are assigned to the buyer by Highland Carbon in this instance. And in time, those units are retired. And the retirement is essentially when the quantity of carbon is accumulated within the project that meets that sum. So that's how it works. Now, there are companies who are moving into this space who are considering doing their own projects. What I mean by that is buying estates and planting trees on them and working with project developers. That is something we can also help with. We can help companies to undertake those sorts of large-scale projects as well. That is something that is becoming a bit more common now. So in those instances, I suppose you could say it's an investment because they are buying the units directly, but they're not in a chain, and that is why they're able. That's why they're able to do that. They are the originators of the units, and they hold those units. So it's not a buying and selling mechanism. So it's very unlike, say, cap and trade, which you might be familiar with.
Well, thanks for that clarification.
You're welcome.
Hi, Richard. My name is Peter Paul. I just two things. I wanted to say thank you for putting the most northern remnant of the Caledonian forest on that map of yours. I used to live very close to it at Allerdale Wilderness Reserve, and I enjoyed very much seeing the sort of the family of trees that live there still, which is closely related to the last trees that were in the area, say between 5,000 and 9,000 years ago. So when I saw that map of the black spots dotted around, I said, "Hey, I know that northern one." So so thanks for that. What I wanted to ask is, sticking to the topic of your presentation, with carbon credits is a sort of a marketplace that's quickly evolving. But when it comes to sort of biodiversity credits, what kind of development would you see happening for Scotland?
So there's something now called biodiversity net gain, which is becoming a formal framework. And there's really specialist ecologists working in that arena. And so it is looking at before and after, looking at the biodiversity of a site before a project takes place, and then looking at it afterwards. A carbon offsetting project like a peatland project or a forestry project, as we've been describing, can be a part of that, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. So an estate can also, for example, create a new pond or manage the meanderings of their burns and rivers and the hydrology of an estate to enhance biodiversity in other ways. And we're quite keen to partner with NGOs. We are partnering with an NGO on one of our sites now as it relates to seed banks. And just to say, Peter Paul, I've been to Allerdale, so I've seen it firsthand. I know what it's like. It's a fantastic project. It's a good example of what can be done. And Allerdale was really involved with it early days. And what's special there is I know you've got your Scottish wildcat breeding program, and at one point even moose on the estate, I remember. So I know there's bold ambitions up there. It's a great example actually of how sometimes one large estate can really set the tone, and then other landowners will follow. That's something that we're seeing. Is there's a change in culture in the Highlands away from just fishing, shooting, and into biodiversity. So yeah.
Well, if you ever need a guest speaker to convince more estate owners to get on board, you've got my contact details. You know, we've made quite some drastic decisions over the last, say, 4 years. And one of them was to stop any commercial stalking on the estate. And I was able to replace all the revenue that we lost because of that decision within the year, effectively, with nature-based tourism. So more jobs locally, more local involvement, fewer deer, 3 to 4 per square kilometer at the moment, coming from I think 8 to 10 many years ago. So it kind of proves that if you have the right mindset and motivation, then you can really make big changes. And as always, you know, as you pointed out, you know, the deer pressure is so amazing throughout Scotland. I believe 400,000 red deer alone, which I think if you look at the landmass should be closer to 40,000. So there's a really big issue there. And but point being, you know, I'd love to continue this chat maybe in another way, because maybe I can add some value somewhere.
It'd be great to pick up that conversation with you, Peter Paul. I very much appreciate that. My background is in zoology, so I did look quite a lot into red deer when I was starting to meet with landowners and deer managers.
Yeah.
They are very knowledgeable people.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I definitely felt the need to do some swatting up for that. But it was quite helpful for me because I lived in North America, where we had the Rocky Mountain elk and the elk. They're cousins of the red deer, and they live in mainly dense forests and mix forage around clearings, but they're a forest species in the same way that red deer on the continent are a forest species. So even though red deer are a symbol of Scotland, they live in a completely altered landscape, one in which they wouldn't have normally lived in if they had another option. I think it's really helpful what you say about financial benefits to estates. So estates that have genuine green credentials, like Allerdale, have seen the benefits that can happen, and I'm finding that in conversations with landowners who have other strands of income. So it could be that they have ecotourism. On the back of ecotourism, they have accommodation and events. They may have food that they source from the estate. They may have agricultural products as well. And by having the green credentials across all of these strands of income, they can uplift the overall. So there is a strong case for being aware and green. And of course, in the big picture, Scotland being an almost blank canvas is a global opportunity. So we have here really a world-class opportunity for offsetting at scale in one of the most famous places in the world. Certainly the Highlands are known from, you know, Japan to Russia to Argentina, from film and screen. And it's a dramatic landscape, and it's wonderful to see what's happening. It's really starting to turn now, and there's momentum growing. So it's an exciting time.
You could add community engagement to that mix.
Yes.
You know, if you look at deer management groups and how estates are run, if stalking and sports are the predominant revenue stream, you know, head stalker maybe with a ghillie or two, and that's about it in terms of employment opportunities. But if you change those dynamics, you know, locally, you can add far more permanent jobs and full-time employment numbers to that mix. So from experience, it really changes the whole dynamics of it all. But low community engagement is really a very important driver for all of that, and not something to be considered by any estate owner, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. There's a lot of interest at the moment in well-being, physical and mental well-being, especially during lockdown. People were really turning to nature quite a lot more than they usually would. And Scotland is one of the only places in the world where doctors actually prescribe going into nature for mental health and for well-being. So it's wonderful. I hope that people from around the world will see this and get some inspiration from that, because it's really a reflection of our fit within nature. We are part of nature, aren't we?
Well, that's one of the elements of that. The definition of natural capital should include physical, mental well-being. And again, that presents all sorts of business opportunities. And what I did up north was start to organize and host all sorts of retreats. So yoga in the Highlands is something we tried, which was quite successful. But also breathing exercises, cold exposure, cold immersion in winter. And those are all things you can add to the mix and still plant trees, restore peatland. You can do it. You can have a sort of broad spectrum approach, and sort of expand on the definition of what natural capital actually is.
Yeah, I just noticed, by the way, that David Bastioni is in this meeting. He's one of our board members, and he's normally based in Manhattan. I just wanted to say hello to David, and I assume you were in New York.
I am actually. Can you hear me? Okay,
yes,
Richard?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for joining.
Yes, so I'm a member of the board of advisors for Highland Carbon, and actually have a relationship with Scotland that goes back to when I was in school there, from the age of 8 till 17. And funnily enough, one of the projects Richard has going on in Pitlochry, close to where I went to prep school, an old school called Crofton Loan up there. So I have the connection to Scotland. Went to secondary school in Edinburgh, and then came over here to Canada for university, and then settled in New York City for work. So my company, what I focus on a lot is consulting with international organizations and corporations on sustainable development goals and the 2030 agenda, and was able to connect with Richard and find out more about what Highland Carbon is doing. So I'm doing my part to support his work and what they're doing, and provide some guidance in terms of SDGs, as well as overall sustainability consulting. And so I'm really amazed at the progress that's been made in just over the last few months, based on what was done last year. And so excited to see what comes next.
Well, thank you, David. Yeah, it's Highland Carbon is a relatively young organization, and we've grown quickly to working with 7 estates now, and we are speaking with 5 other estates at the moment. So it's really an exponential growth, and that is so encouraging, because there's so much to be done for the climate and for nature. So and I neglected to mention that we received an award recently, which was Best UK-wide Carbon Offsetter from the Small Business Association. So we're delighted to be recognized as well. So it's an exciting time for us.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Something that I want to add on, because one of the questions that I had there, I was curious about rewilding coming into it, going, oh, is it just about nature, and where's the people aspect? And what I've really appreciated, Richard and Peter Paul, is the conversation that you've had there, that when it's changing the culture, in some ways it's readdressing the imbalance that was created when people were forced off the land and the grazing habits started, of how do we actually bring people back into greater harmony with the land and allow them to exist together, but people and nature together, or that definition of what you said there, expanding the natural capital, but the land should be able to support as many people as possible in a way that's sustainable for everybody. And I think that was a really nice nuance and highlighting there. Where I want to go, and I'm curious, because if people have been following the flow of conversations that have kind of gone on throughout all of the future series, carbon offsetting was mentioned during our Lighthouse event at COP26, and we were asking some of the panelists' opinions on it. And one of the panelists said, well, I kind of think of carbon offsetting as a con, because it's kind of like you go speeding and then you pay the ticket. You know, you shouldn't be speeding in the first place. And that was the analogy that was being used. So knowing that that was already said, I'd appreciate if you could just expand a little bit more, Richard, on what really is the value of carbon offsetting and how does it fit in? Is it really kind of, you know, paying the fine after you've done the wrong, or is it, as I'm starting to kind of see from the conversation, something that's about regenerating the land and bringing humans and nature back into balance?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak to that, because that is part of the narrative across social media. I would say it's a distorted narrative. And what I mean by that is it creates a false dichotomy that companies are only offsetting. And in my experience, companies are taking enormous steps to reduce. And the offsetting is part of a greater strategy. And I'll give you an example. We partner with a Scotch company called Nickneen, and they're net zero through our partnership. When we started to talk to them about offsetting, they had already reduced their emissions by 90%. And so really they're offsetting the remainder. And it's the remainder which is very difficult to offset based on current technology and current supply. So I'll put this another way. If you consider units being £11 a ton, or up to £15 a ton, if a company had a footprint of 100,000 tons, would they really want to buy those? It would be much more cost effective to buy in energy efficient heaters, light bulbs, bring in solar energy and so on, which is why companies are investing enormously in reduction. Something that I've observed, I'd say in the last 4 years, is that most of the people I would talk to at the time, their title was corporate social responsibility, and environment was like one element of a much broader community public relations endeavor. Today, most medium and large companies have a sustainability director or a sustainability manager. And certainly with the larger companies, they are on the senior management team and or the board of directors. So sustainability has become integrated into business culture at a remarkable pace. The other thing I'll mention, I'll add to this, is I went to the NEC last year where it was a sustainability trade event. And it absolutely blew me away that all the rechargeable electric buses and rubbish lorries and taxis, and that, you know, it's just absolutely mind blowing that all of the sectors of the economy had a sustainable offering on show to do with energy sourcing and reducing energy use. So I would say that that sort of narrative, the either or narrative, is outdated. And it's not something that I experience.
No, I appreciate you speaking to that. And Peter Paul has just put reduce, compensate and offset in. And it's, you know, if you're an SME coming into this conversation, watching the recordings and going, I'm kind of overwhelmed on where to start and, you know, where my journey is. What we're really saying is here, well, start by reducing, you know, do the things to reduce emissions. This is for later on in your journey, you know, so as a smaller SME, this is not going to be something that you're going to be thinking about straight away. It kind of comes later on down the line.
Well, perhaps, but I would say that there has been a significant change in the last year or two. Since the UK has set net zero targets and Scotland has set net zero targets, companies are now starting to do both at the same time. Mm-hmm. So they have a strategy. Something we can help them with, by the way, is the reduction side. It's a service we offer as well. They develop a strategy in parallel where they know they will reduce to, say, 10% or 20% of energy use by a certain milestone, and then plan their offset to land at that same moment so that they are net zero by a particular date, for example. So increasingly it's happening in parallel, and there's probably not time to do them one after the other now, given the need to achieve 1.5 degrees and given where society is going. I don't think we probably have the luxury of waiting to offset anymore. We may have perhaps 5 years ago, but I think we've perhaps crossed that Rubicon now.
Okay, and that's useful to know, because I mean, what you're basically saying is, what I'm really hearing is this is long-term planning. You know, you can't just be coming in from a short-term perspective and short-term gains. You have to be thinking about 2045 and where you need to be, and almost, I suppose, reverse engineering the process so that you're doing both at the right timing and the flow works in order to get the targets that you need to make.
I think an interesting discussion, one of the biggest discussions in this space, is where's the price going? And there is one assumption, which is that if companies want to commit to net zero 2030 or 2045, that the carbon price is going to leap up in 2029 or 2044. And I'm not sure that's the case, and I'll explain why. At the moment in the UK, there are more than 14 million tons of offsetting available in nature-based solutions. There's several hundred projects that currently exist. There's probably another 1,000 or thousands that are in train, that are being developed. So the supply is growing substantially. And the other thing that's happening is that companies are much more interested in locking in their supply now. So they make a purchase now for units that will have a particular vintage to them, so they can achieve a net zero in future. They are managing their risk as it relates to increased price, the potential for increased price. So it's becoming the norm that companies are buying now and not waiting. So I think one of the biggest risks to the supply chain is those who want to hold units and wait and see what happens, because the speed at which companies are achieving net zero is so mind-blowing that the market is going to be substantially reduced by 2029. There's not going to be a vast amount of tonnage to offset, I don't think, because companies will have been proactive by then. It's a very dynamic environment, and there's so much happening.
I appreciate that. I like that. So reasons to be optimistic there, Richard, in terms of what you're saying. I just want to come to Juliet and Nina, and I'm curious if either of you have any questions as we're moving towards the end of the session.
I actually did. You were talking earlier about including humans into the conversation about rewilding, and I was wondering if you had any projects with regards to agroforestry in a way of involving rewilding, but also looking at agriculture and how that could evolve towards something that is more sustainable.
I have been involved with sustainable agriculture internationally in the past. I used to work in international conservation, so I've been involved with tropical forest protection and agroforestry. It's used a lot with things like coffee and chocolate, for example. In the UK, it's a little bit different because the zones where the agriculture is happening is typically somewhere else from where the rewilding is happening. The rewilding is happening on, for example, mountainsides, and the agriculture is more in the valleys. I suppose there's some synergy as it relates to things like grazing and reduced deer pressure, but you wouldn't have, say, necessarily ribbons of forest and arable crops, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because of the cost of fencing. If you have a large, sort of round shaped project, you can run a fence around it. It's a lot cheaper than lots of linear projects. Having said that, there's all sorts of opportunities for community forests and things like orchards and food woods, if you like, that happen more to do with communities. One of the projects where I'm working, which is on Loch Rannoch, a future phase they're looking to do is to have a community orchard at that site. So these things do come up in conversation in the context of the whole of the estate, but not necessarily in the carbon framework, if you see what I mean, because the carbon framework is within a strictly accounted for managed space. Yeah,
I understand. Have you had the opportunity or have any farmers reached out to you with regards to rewilding?
Yes. Most of the estates where we are working have agricultural operations. They're large estates, so they could have, 400 head of cattle and, hundreds of sheep, for example. So in their case, they are managing their impact. So interestingly, peatland projects can be really beneficial for cattle. If you have them at the low, they can be at lower elevation, not necessarily at higher elevation, and at lower elevation, they can keep the fields drier and then retain forage for the cattle along the margins. And cattle can also wade out into them. They can be allowed in within reason, provided they aren't at risk of hurting themselves on any of the dams that are constructed. So it'd be a managed process. So that is something that happens. And there's an interesting video that Peatland Action has created where they interview farmers about how they're using the land on their for their cattle and their sheep in relation to peatland.
Since we were talking about communities reaching out or farmers reaching out at that point, you were talking about the inclusion of remote communities. Have people given any feedback, or have they reached out about other things that they would want to implement that aren't necessarily agroforestry, or where they want to do more or less, or anything?
Where there are the biggest projects, there's opportunities to do quite a lot more. And so with the biggest projects, for example, there's an aspiration to have nature centers on site and educational components, where there's a community educational component which benefits the schools and the local community, and where there are spaces for conservation work to be done, whether it's people who are studying golden eagles or Scottish wildcats or whatever it is, that they have some facilities that they can use as part of the overall project. The other thing to say, which I've neglected to mention, is that Scotland has the right to roam. So I believe it's the only place in the UK where the public can walk across private land. So they have the right of access to all of these places anyway, and there's footpaths and access points so people can see the projects. Some of the larger initiatives, there's access being put in for disability, for example, for wheelchairs and so forth. And that's something that I'd be quite keen to do on some of our bigger projects where there's roads nearby where the public can get to them.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
We're just coming to the end of the session, so I'm curious if there's any more questions, comments or feedback from anybody on the call before we're wrapping up.
I had a quick question, if I can, and with this Highland Carbon, and we're talking about Scotland a lot. I mean, here on the call from a bit further south. I'm just curious really to see how you'd contrast Scotland to the rest of the UK, and whether you think that kind of I suppose forward-looking initiatives are going to come down further south, because I guess England's quite crowded, and where we are in London is certainly are crowded, but we've got Wales, there's a bit more wilderness there. So I just wonder how those other parts compare to Scotland. What do you think will be reforesting or doing something interesting like that on a larger scale down here?
Yeah, thank you for that, Andre. So yes, for the benefit of everybody, we've got a project that we're supporting in Northumberland at the moment. And Andre, I believe you guys are supporting that from memory. That project is near Amble. So it's near the coast. It's sort of Harry Potter country. They filmed the castle scenes up there. There's a lot of big forests across the north of England. So you've got the North Pennines area of outstanding natural beauty. And that's an area that we're looking at and talking to landowners. We are also speaking with landowners in Snowdonia and other parts of the UK at the moment. So one of those conversations is in relation to the West Country. So we do take an interest in other parts of the country, and especially where those projects meet our vision, which is for genuine benefits to conservation and biodiversity. And so, for example, this project in Northumberland is near a red squirrel forest. So there's a great deal of biodiversity in the Northeast. So it is also a great location. I think what's the other thing to go back to the Scottish example is that the Highlands are officially designated as an endangered landscape. And Snowdonia is also. So I think we have two official designations in the UK, and across all of Europe, I believe there are 8 or 9 of these locations. So, for example, Spain has one, Romania has one. So on a continental scale, these are important, but they aren't the only places that are important. there's a lot of the landscape has been so altered across the whole of the UK that there's a lot that we can do in other locations as well.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we've probably got time for one more question, if anybody's got one more question. I think that's the end then. It's been really interesting, and what I love, Richard, throughout the themes today so far, you know, we've had Bremley Lingdo talking about how he's doing ecosystem reforestation in Meghalaya, India, which is known apparently as the Scotland of the East, making that bridge and link between the Scotland of the West. And then we've had Gib Bullock talking about how he wants to create, I would say, centres for innovation embedded in community and restoring natural landscapes on the Isle of Bute. That's another connection that I want to make there. The strongest theme that's really emerging for me throughout all of these conversations is community and the need to actually bring people together in conversation, so that this is not about regeneration being done to people. It's very much a collaborative process, and I think it speaks to that deeper understanding of what's emerged in today's conversation about rewilding. Really is not just the rewilding of nature, but it's the rewilding and the recognition and the remembering that humans are part of nature, and we need to be embedded and actively part of that landscape. And I just also want to give anybody who's watching the recording a little plug, but also to join in. Peter Paul is going to be a speaker on Monday, and he's going to be talking about how we can rewild the way that we think. So very much building on what you've talked about today, Richard, and feeding into that psychological aspect of what does it take for us as humans to realise that we are part of natural capital too, and what's possible won't happen. So I hope that maybe some of you will join us for that session, but also the people watching the recording will come and join that session too. Thank you everybody for giving up your time today. I really appreciate it. I know that with COP26 going on, there's a lot going on, and I'm just grateful that you've joined this conversation today to be part of the conversation. Thank you very much.